friendship and going elsewhere after this year, but he has been a very valued member of our committee, and his treasure chest of knowledge on this issue is boundless, and I'm just so happy and thankful that we've had Jerry Costello to represent us on this issue for so many years. Recognize him for as much time as he wants.
Gentleman from Illinois is recognized for such time as he may consume.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you, and I thank the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Ray Hall, and let me thank him not only for his friendship and his kind words, but for his leadership on the committee on so many issues. As the chairman pointed out, we were in a markup until almost 3 a.m. this morning, and Mr. Ray Hall led us on our side of the aisle in working together to try and come up with a better product than was presented to us last night, and so I thank him. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the conference report. I want to say from the outset that I am deeply disappointed in the change to the Railway Labor Act that was added to the conference report during final negotiations on the National Mediation Board provision between Speaker Boehner and Majority Leader Reid. The NMB language should have been dropped altogether, as Mr. Ray Hall indicated in his statement. Congress should not be amending the Railway Labor Act in this bill. Importantly, there are several provisions in the conference report that help organize labor, and after working on this legislation for over 5 years, I believe it's necessary to move forward and enact a multi-year reauthorization of the Federal Aviation Administration. However, I want to be clear. I join the ranking member, Mr. Ray Hall, and many others that if the Railway Labor Act change proves to have significant impact, negative impact, on the right to organize, we must come back and revisit this issue. One of my highest priorities in the FAA reauthorization bill has been and is fair bargaining rights for employees at the FAA. After leading the fight for many years, I am pleased that the conference report establishes a process for mediation and binding arbitration of impasses between the FAA and its unions. As Chairman Petri indicated, the FAA Modernization and Reform Act provides $63 billion for FAA infrastructure programs, operations, and research over the 4-year period of the bill. I wanted to see higher funding levels and a passenger facility charge increase for job-creating airport infrastructure projects. However, the funding levels in this conference report are an improvement over the 2008 levels originally proposed in the House-passed bill. They are roughly levels with the current year appropriation. The conference report also includes a number of safety provisions in the FAA reauthorization bill that we had in previous Congresses, such as a stronger requirement for maintenance work performed on U.S. commercial airlines by outside contractors. It also requires the FAA to assess the appropriate staff levels for air traffic controllers, FAA managers, and aviation safety inspectors. In addition, the conference report takes important steps to advance the next generation air traffic control system that is desperately needed not only by the industry and for the flying public, but for the country as a whole. We create a new Chief Next-Gen Officer who will serve as the primary point of contact for next-gen implementation at the FAA to provide accountability and stability and require reporting metrics to ensure that next-gen is making progress. Further, we require the FAA to work closely with affected unions in the planning, development, and deployment of next-gen. I wrote this provision in the bill 4 years ago, and I'm glad to see that it will be enacted into law in this conference report. Finally, Mr. Speaker, despite the flaws that we talked about in the bill, we desperately need a long-term FAA reauthorization bill, and that's why I'm supporting this bill. I thank the ranking member, Mr. Ray Hall, Chairman Mica, Chairman Petri, and other committee members for all of their hard work on this legislation, and I thank the staff on both sides of the aisle that have worked very hard over the past 5 years to try and bring us to the point that we are today to get a bill on the President's desk. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from West Virginia reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Yield myself 15 seconds, and then I'll yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, one of the conferees. the senior member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. I just want to spend that 15 seconds to say how much Pat, Micah, and I have enjoyed our relationship with Jerry Costello and his wife, Georgia. People don't know a lot about Congress and how many friends there are across the aisle, and how we could be privileged to have somebody like Jerry Costello, both to chair an aviation subcommittee, be a ranking member, a key player. Yield back the balance of that 15 seconds.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of the conference report for the FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012. This is a very good bipartisan, bicameral conference report, and I want to congratulate Chairman Micah, Ranking Member Ray Hall, Chairman Petri, and a special congratulations and thanks to Ranking Member Costello for your years of service here. It's been a pleasure serving with you, and I wish you the best as you ride off into the sunset. But I'm sure you'll be doing great things in the future. So again, thanks for all your hard work in your years here in Congress. Again, I'm rising in support of the Modernization and Reform Act. It does not raise taxes or passenger facility charges. It holds spending levels through 2015 at $63 billion over the 4 years, and it does not add to the deficit, which I'm very pleased to see. It provides long-term stability for the FAA and the aviation industry, which is certainty in that transportation sector, which has sorely been missing in the economy. So we believe it's going to create and sustain good-paying jobs. It accelerates and requires accountability for the deployment of NextGen, the FAA's Air Traffic Control Modernization Program, which we need to be able to more efficiently manage the skies above us. It provides for an unprecedented reform to the National Mediation Board. I'm disappointed that we were unable to include the European Union's emissions trading scheme prohibition language. We will continue to pursue that the passage of that bill. I think it's something we really need to focus on here in Congress before that the taxes started to be collected and it do great damage, harm to our aviation airline industry. This is a responsible and much-needed conference report. Therefore, I urge all members to vote to pass the conference report for the FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield at this point to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, 3 minutes, member of the Conference Committee as well.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Well, I was named conferee. I've been on the Aviation Committee for 26 years. There was no legislative conference. The most contentious provision of the bill was a deal that was struck between Harry Reid, the Majority Leader of the Senate, and Speaker Boehner, and it was a take-it-or-leave-it deal. Now, this bill is absolutely critical to the safety and security of the aviation system of the United States of America. It's critical for its modernization. It's critical for its competitiveness. These things are extraordinarily important to our country. Aviation constitutes, in aggregate, about 10 or 11% of our gross domestic product. It is not a sector that we can continue to ignore and underfund in terms of providing it with the tools it needs to be more fuel efficient and safer for the traveling public and more efficient for business transport and goods. But those things should not be held hostage to the incredible anti-labor bias of the majority here in the House. The bill that passed our committee would have established a rule for the formation of a union that said anybody who was eligible to vote who didn't vote counts as a no. Well, I went and reviewed the elections of every member of Congress, and guess what? If we had that rule, if every person who was a potentially eligible voter would be counted as a no vote in your election, not one member of Congress, even those who get 80%, would have been elected because you didn't get them, because you had more people who didn't vote than you got votes. Not one member of Congress. But that would be fair for the working people of America, according to the Republicans here in the House. That was an incredibly egregious provision. Outrageous. So then we move to the Senate. Well, we go through this little thing last summer where we actually shut down the FAA. Now, I know you don't care about 4,000 federal employees. That's fine. But you also put out of work 78,000 people who were working in the private sector on the modernization and updates of our aviation system and our airports, all over, wanting and hating unions. Now, I don't get it. I don't get why you hate unions and working people. I really don't understand that. So here we come to the final product. And the final product will make it much easier for someone, an anti-labor airline out there perhaps, to de-unionize in, say, a merger or even in an election, because their furloughed employees would count in an election. You don't know who they are, where they are, they get to vote. And you have to have an election to have an election. And you have to win the election to have an election. This is not a fair provision. We need the changes in this bill, but we do not need to attack the working people of the United States of America.
Myself 30 seconds and then 3 minutes to the, is it 3 or 4? 3 minutes to the chairman of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee of the House, distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hall. Yield myself that time. Well, let me just say that we did not change the provision of the law, that it still requires the same provisions that the NMB put in place that changed 70 years of labor law. Anyone who shows up, if there's 1,000 people in the union and 200 show up, 101 can have a vote and go into the union. We did change a requirement, and actually I didn't negotiate it specifically. I'll yield myself another 30 seconds. It was negotiated by Mr. Boehner, our Speaker, and the leadership controlled by the Democrats in the Senate. And in fact, it is fair to labor, because it does require a certain number of people to sign up to have the election. I think it's a good compromise. The House voted to do away with the provision that the gentleman spoke about. Republicans are concerned and want to help labor. In fact, the vice chair of our subcommittee, Mr. Kravak, is a union card-carrying member of the union, so that's bogus. Thank you.
Yes, the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise, of course, in support of the conference report of H.R. 658. And to begin with, I think I recognized our chairman gave accolades to all those he worked with, and I think we owe accolades back to him and his fine staff. The word transportation indicates travel, and he's traveled all over this country to bring this bill together. I don't think he's turned anybody down that's asked him to come to help them with their area and given us due consideration. The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, working with our Senate counterparts, helped write Title IX, reauthorizing federal aviation research and development. We also worked with our friends on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee to draft various sections relating to the FAA's next-gen air transportation system in Title II, sections relating to unmanned aircraft systems in Title III, and the provision addressing commercial space launch licenses, and appreciate working with Jerry Costello along that line. He's been a gentleman. We'll miss him. The FAA underpins our nation's economy and helps sustain a high quality of life, enabling people to travel safely, reliably, conveniently, and relatively inexpensively to virtually every corner of the nation and the world. It's a 24/7 operation staffed by high-trained and dedicated controllers and technicians who rely on evolving technologies to ensure mission success. A robust research and development program is fundamental to FAA's role. The next-gen program, which is expected to cost well over $20 billion when completed, will modernize our air traffic control system. to accommodate ever-increasing numbers of flights, but doing so safely, efficiently, and with less fuel burn. Even though FAA is a highly automated, technologically driven agency, one of the peculiar ironies is its low level of investment in R&D. For year 2012, FAA requested an R&D budget of $386 million, which amounts to slightly less than 2.5% of the agency's total budget. That's a small level of investment for an agency that relies heavily on automation and is only made possible because of aeronautics-related R&D activities funded by the National and Space Administration, which is carefully coordinated with the FAA and industry. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that Mr. Micah and his leadership were able to bring closure on this matter, on this important bill. I urge all members to support it. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman from West Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield now to the gentlelady from Texas, who's not only a member of our Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, but also our ranking Democrat on the Science and Technology Committee, Ms. Eddie Bernice Johnson, for 3 minutes.
Gentlelady is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me thank the Chairman and ranking member of the full Committee of Transportation and Infrastructure, as well as the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and simply say that at the end of this year, I would have completed 2 decades on both of these committees. And you know, on committees is where you develop most of your friendships. Jerry Costello and his wife, Georgia, have been one of those true friendships that I've experienced. And I'll miss him greatly, and I'll miss her greatly when he retires, and I hope they'll visit often. My role as a conferee on this conference committee was that as ranking member of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. And I'd like to highlight some of the provisions in the bill that fall within the jurisdiction of this committee. The next-gen modernization authorized in this bill will transform the national airspace system. Through next-gen satellite-based traffic management, we will be able to address increased congestion in our nation's skies, while improving safety and reducing the environmental footprint of our air transport. Transitioning to a GPS-based air traffic control system will allow airlines to reduce flight delays, save fuel, and cut the amount of harmful emissions from aircraft engines. There is no doubt that successful implementation of NextGen will boost our economy and enable the creation of more jobs. The bill also authorizes the Secretary of Transportation to establish a Center for Excellence to develop innovation in jet fuel production, spurring the development of new and better energy technologies. Through the conference committee, we were able to improve upon the version initially passed by the House of Representatives. But as with all legislation, there were many compromises. There were several aspects of this legislation which I believe could further be improved, as any piece of legislation. On balance, however, the conference report contains needed policy direction and authorizations that warrant member support. While the funding proposed for research and development is less than I believe we need to invest, the conference report represents an improvement over the funding levels in the House passed bill. I'm also disappointed that the commercial space transportation provision included in this conference report was done so without the benefit of a serious review of its impacts. I expect that Chairman Hall and I will be taking a serious look at these issues associated with commercial space transportation and this provision during the remainder of the session of this Congress. Could I have another minute?
I yield to the gentlelady additional minute.
I am, however, pleased that a number of policy provisions we worked on in the Science, Space, and Technology Committee have been included in this conference report. For example, the House mandates FAA research on methods and procedures to improve confidence in and the timeliness of certification of new technologies for introduction into the national airspace system. So, Mr. Speaker, there is much work to be done to keep our skies safe, but it is certainly time for Congress to act. This reauthorization is the culmination of years of work that has not been fair to the FAA and its employees for trying to figure out whether they're going to exist or not, with 23 extensions. And so with the guidance to pursue its long-term initiatives, we will take our aviation system into the 21st century. And I urge my colleagues to support this imperfect bill. But let me say, Mr. Speaker, I have not yet experienced a perfect bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2.5 minutes to the young, dynamic leader and chair of the Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee of the Science, Space, Technology Committee, gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Palazzo.
Gentleman's recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time. I rise in support of the conference report to H.R. 658, reauthorizing the Federal Aviation Administration through fiscal year 2015. Early last year, the Space and Aeronautics Subcommittee held an oversight hearing on FAA's research and development programs. On March 9, 2011, Science Committee Chairman Ralph Hall introduced H.R. 970, the Federal Aviation Research and Development Act of 2011. And a month later, it was reported out of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. The bill was ultimately incorporated into H.R. 658, which is now before us. FAA's Research, Engineering, and Development accounts funds a number of programs and projects that are essential to the agency's ongoing safety, capacity, and air traffic modernization efforts. To give a few examples of its safety-related activities, FAA conducts research on the flammability of materials used in airplane cabins and on methods to improve fire suppression systems, research on mitigation of aircraft icing, on early detection of cracks and failure modes related to aging aircraft, and improving our understanding of human factors. In the environmental arena, examples include research on fuel additives to replace lead in aviation gasoline that powers piston engine aircraft, and better characterizing aviation's impact on local air quality. With regard to air traffic control, FAA is investing a considerable portion of its R&D funding on the next-gen modernization program to increase the capacity of airspace, improve safety, and provide for more efficient routings. Most of FAA's R&D is managed out of its technical center located at Atlantic City, New Jersey Airport, but as many members are aware, FAA also engages a large number of leading research universities using competitively selected cooperative research grants. Mr. Speaker, this is a fiscally responsible R&D provision, funding FAA's Research, Engineering, and Development account at its current spending level of $168 million a year for each year through 2015. This is well below amounts proposed by the Senate during conference negotiations. I support this conference report and urge members to support it as well, and I thank Mr. Micah for all of his hard work. I yield back.
Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield to our ranking Democrat on the House Education and Labor Committee and a true friend and leader of the interests of all working men and women of this country, especially our coal miners, the gentleman from California, if he's ready, Mr. Miller, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes. Without objection.
I thank the gentleman for yielding me this time. And, Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this conference report. This compromise stands as an example of why it is counterproductive to negotiate with hostage takers. Initially, the Republicans insisted that to keep the FAA up and running, we make union elections as unfair as possible. For instance, they said that if a union election, we should count anyone who did not vote in that election as a no vote. Members of Congress immediately recognized that none of us would win those elections and none of us would be here today, and if it's unfair for us, it must be also unfair for the workers of this country. The Republicans gave up that demand thanks to the Democrats. The rule providing for fair elections is protected. But instead of succeeding at making union elections unfair, this conference report makes these elections difficult, if not impossible, to hold at all. This report contains numerous statutory changes, not rules changes, but statutory changes that will make it harder for workers to get an election and to have a voice at work. A voice at work, a fundamental right granted to every worker in this nation by the laws of this nation. And these changes will require an act of Congress to undo. The compromise leads to absurdities. Under the election rule, the rule, which is safe for the time being, Workers need a majority of actual votes to win in a union election, and that's fine. But under the conference report, to even hold an election, workers must first get a majority of all of the eligible workers to sign cards supporting the unions. These are nationwide units stretched across the country. You don't have access to all of these workers. You don't even know where many of them are. And in the airlines, many of them may have been furloughed for a number of years. Imagine if a congressional election was run this way. To get on the ballot, you first needed a majority of all of the voters in your district to sign cards saying they supported you. But you didn't know who those voters were, and you didn't know where they lived. None of us would be elected. I asked for 30 seconds.
I yield the gentleman an additional minute.
None of us would be elected under this requirement. In fact, there probably wouldn't even be an election. And once again, we wouldn't run under these conditions. We wouldn't participate in election under these conditions, and yet we're insisting that American workers have their elections rigged in this fashion. And at this point, especially when you see how it might work in airline mergers, there again, this rule works against the workers in trying to assemble the election unit. Mr. Speaker, I cannot support this bill. It undermines the rights of American workers for no purpose other than to satisfy the ideological demands of the Republicans and their special interest backers. I urge my colleagues to join me in defeating this conference report.
Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, member of the Science, Space, Technology Committee, senior member.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I rise in support of the conference report on H.R. 658. This legislation goes a long way to addressing some concerns I have had regarding our nation's aviation enterprise. 2 of those provisions I would highlight this morning. The first is an extension of a provision from legislation that I supported back in 2004 when I was chairman of the Space Subcommittee of the House Science Committee. Let me note that these provisions inaccurately were just described as not having had hearings. There were lots of hearings on these provisions. The provisions relate to the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation and is designed to make certain the FAA does not limit the development of the commercial human spaceflight industry without specific data about what will increase safety. This extension will encourage continued research and development while building industry-wide flight experience so these companies can best serve new and existing markets. This includes expanding the research portfolio for federally funded science in the upper atmosphere and in space. The second provision provides a slight increase in the number of flights from Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport so that it can accommodate these flights to and from the West Coast. This small increase will help my constituents in Southern California and all Americans in the western states to meet their representatives in Washington, D.C., or visit the Smithsonian, or perhaps enjoy the cherry blossoms in the spring. It will also enable those in the Washington area to visit California's beaches, California's sunshine, and perhaps maybe want to join the Freedom Surf team. This legislation takes us a step closer to removing the unnecessary and unfair restrictions on flights to the West Coast. Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield to the gentlelady from Florida, who is our ranking member on the Railroad Subcommittee on Transportation and Infrastructure, Ms. Corrine Brown, for 2 minutes.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank Chairman Micah and Member Ray Hall for their work in bringing the FAA bill to the floor. But I particularly want to thank Mr. Costello, because without his leadership and working this bill through for many years, we would not have a bill on the floor, and the public really owes you a great debt of gratitude, and I want to thank you. And, you know, I think the aviation community deserves a long-term aviation bill so they can plan for the future needs of the traveling public. We have had 23 extensions already, and it's really time to send a bill to the President. But this is not a perfect bill. And I don't support the labor compromises in this bill and don't believe it should have been in the aviation bill in the first place. But our airports, airlines, and passengers have waited too long for this important safety provisions. My home state of Florida relies on air service to support our tourist-based economy. We have 20 primary airports, 22 reliever airports, and 57 general aviation airports, with our top 3 airports generating close to 45 million employments a year. This airport creates jobs and helps grow the economy. And I really got to say that if we don't pass this, that probably will not be any transportation or putting people to work. Because the piece that we passed 3 o'clock this morning out of the Transportation Committee is the worst bill I have seen in the 30 years I've been elected. I've been in transportation 10 years in the Florida House and close to 20 here, and it was truly the worst bill I ever seen. When people from California went into the bill and took almost $1 billion from the people from California. People from Houston took it, not only taking the safety of the public, taking the transportation dollars, doing away with all of the regulations. May I have an additional minute? It is truly a sad day for transportation, and this will probably be our only work product. Because, you know, members come to the floor and they rail about the Senate. Well, let me tell you something. The Senate don't have to take up our bad work. And, in fact, this bill, this transportation bill, should be dead on arrival when it gets to the Senate. And I will do all I can to continue to work, to put people to work, and work for making sure that we have a transportation and infrastructure bill that will really put people to work, because we know for every $1 billion we spend, it generates 44,000 jobs. Truly the worst bill I've ever seen. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida.
Yield myself 30 seconds, Mr. Chairman, and then I'm going to yield 1 minute to the Chair of the Aviation Subcommittee, Mr. Petra. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to hear the cooperative tone of the other side of the aisle who had the opportunity when they controlled both the House, the Senate, and the White House to pass a bill and failed to do so. But I'm really encouraged today by their willingness to come together in a bipartisan effort on behalf of the American people and get one of the most important job creations, infrastructure bills and pieces of legislation, which is our responsibility, done. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would be remiss to see the discussion of this conference report conclude without expressing my admiration and appreciation of the service of our colleague Jerry Costello, for whom I suspect this may be the last FAA reauthorization, although I know he will not be riding off into the sunset. He will be very much around in one capacity or another, continuing to play an important role in developing public policy and affairs. It's been a pleasure to work with him, both as the ranking Republican and again as chairman, and I think he's always been open to comments and suggestions, and it's been a team effort, and especially the leadership that he took in grabbing the bits and helping to establish focus at the FAA for the next-gen effort, which was floundering when you became chairman of the Aviation Committee. It's a major contribution, I think, to an important sector of our economy, and I yield back.
The gentleman from West Virginia has 7½ minutes remaining. The gentleman from Florida has 6 minutes remaining. Gentleman from West Virginia.
Speaker, yes, I yield 3 minutes at this time to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes. Without objection.
Ask unanimous consent. I, too, want to rise today to acknowledge both the chairman and the ranking member. I know that this has not been an easy task, and I certainly want to express my appreciation to Mr. Costello and the work that he has done and the friendship he has shown to members, but the understanding that he has had for this industry. For those of us who represent airports, I cannot deny that this is not an important bill and legislative initiative. So let me thank you, and thank you as well for the late hours that all of you who are on the Transportation Committee engaged in. Might I, for a moment before I speak of this bill, thank the ranking member and Ms. Brown, Congresswoman Brown, Congresswoman Johnson, for saving Houston again and its light rail, something I've worked for almost 20 years. And the amendment last evening that would have defunded Houston's light rail, was absurd and frankly an outrage. I hope as we proceed we'll find a way to recognize that members' projects for their constituents, for regional mobility, should not be tampered with by those living miles away from their community. So I am just thankful for recognition of the importance of rail and job creation. As I indicated, I do rise in support of the infrastructure aspects of this bill. We cannot deny it, and I am grateful in the Airport Trust Fund, language dealing with how do you do the airport fees, the next-gen technology. But I serve as the ranking member on the Transportation Security Committee, and there's language in there about TSO officers. Remember, we were not privatized. We were privatized on 9/11. Despite having never been debated by the Committee on Homeland Security, the Committee of Jurisdiction, and no members being appointed conferees on behalf of the FAA Conference Committee, Section 830 of the Conference Report for the FAA reauthorization has been tampered with. It limits TSA's flexibility to approve or deny an application from an airport to opt out of using federal screening workforce for passenger and baggage screening. Let me remind you, the airports had privatized security on the day of 9/11. That's why we went to the transportation security officers. It places an arbitrary time limitation of 120 days on TSA to determine whether approval of an airport's application would compromise security, affect cost efficiency, or the effectiveness of screening capabilities. It increases administrative burdens on TSA by requiring a tedious paperwork exercise each time an application is denied. Provides a waiver for the existing law that requires private screening, and it says that we shall do it. Besides the poisonous comments,
I'll yield the gentleman additional 30 seconds.
I thank the gentleman. I thank the gentleman. Provides a waiver for the existing law that requires a private screening company contracted will be owned and controlled by a citizen of the United States, meaning that it waives the fact that you have to be a United States citizen to provide security for those who are traveling. And it requires, it says you must privatize some of these airports. Did we learn from 9/11? So besides the poison pill on labor, counting people who don't even show up to vote, now we have a situation where we're forcing our nation's airports to privatize their security. I ask my colleagues to reflect on this challenge. I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to how much time remains on both sides?
The gentleman from Florida has 6 minutes remaining. The gentleman from West Virginia has 4 minutes remaining.
I have no further. I'm sorry, I do have one speaker, and then I would like to reserve. I think I have the right to close on the measure, so we can. I would be pleased at this time to recognize one of the most distinguished chairs of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, a good friend, the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young.
I want to
thank the gentleman's recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I want to congratulate you. And for those that condemn this bill, remember we have not had a reauthorization in the FAA for many, many years. And I think this has been well thought out. This bill will do the job, and we should have did it done for the American people. This is a process of compromise, and we've done this with the Senate side, which is really the problem most of these debates we have as far as conferences go. But it would be a sad day if we didn't pass this legislation, because the work has gone into it, and it does solve lots of problems. It gives a surety for the FAA. They can plan ahead, make our airports safer, make our flyers safer, and have the navigation as necessary. So I congratulate the chairman and the ranking member for getting this bill done. The negotiating part was very difficult, but they've done a good job, and I yield back to balance my time.
Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, who has the right to close?
Gentleman from Florida has the right to close.
Okay, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from California, Ms. Maxine Waters, ranking member on our House Financial Disclosure Committee.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Members, as the member of Congress who represents Los Angeles International Airport, also known as LAX, I know we need a multi-year FAA reauthorization. LAX is the world's 6th busiest airport. LAX creates an estimated 59,000 jobs in or near the airport and has a total annual economic impact estimated at $60 billion. In 2008, 60 million passengers and 1.8 million tons of freight and mail passed through LAX. All of this economic activity depends upon the FAA and the work that it does every day to guarantee a safe and efficient air travel system. My district also includes the Western Pacific Regional Office of the FAA in Hawthorne, California, where dedicated FAA engineers and program managers work plan improvements of airport operations. I'm extremely disappointed that this bill contains language to labor laws affecting the dedicated workers at our nation's airlines and railroads. This labor provision increases the percentage of employees who must express interest in having an election regarding union representation from 35% to 50%. This provision was included without consultation of the workers who will be affected and without a vote on the House floor. It is unfortunate and divisive, and there is no reason for it to be in this bill. Last August, the FAA was forced to shut down many of its operations because the House of Representatives refused to pass a simple bill to extend its funding reauthorization. As a result, 4,000 FAA employees were placed on furlough. Those affected included many of the FAA's engineers, scientists, research analysts, administrative assistants, computer specialists, program managers, environmental protection specialists, and community planners. These government workers were being forced to live without pay for 13 days and were unable to do their job developing our air traffic infrastructure and serving the flying public. I would like to support this bill, but this is problematic, and I reserve my comments further on this bill and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida.
Continue to reserve.
Gentleman from West Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from Illinois. And once again, I cannot say how much we're going to miss his knowledge and his expertise on this and many other issues on our Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. But I yield him the balance of our time on this.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. And again, I thank the ranking member, Mr. Rahal. We've worked very closely together on this legislation, and over the next 9 or 10 months, my service to complete my term, we're going to continue to work together. I want to thank Chairman Mica. We do not always agree on every issue, but we work together in an open process, and he has extended many courtesies to me, and I appreciate his friendship and his leadership. No one wanted to bring this bill to the floor more than he. And a number of us as well, but he's done his very best. He said when he took over as chairman that he was going to bring an FAA bill and a highway bill to the floor, and I think he has every intention to do that, and we're halfway there as of today. And let me say, Mr. Petri, who as chairman of the Aviation Subcommittee for 4 years, I could not have had a better ranking member, and now as ranking member, I could not have a better chair as far as a working relationship, and we've done things in a bipartisan manner. So I thank the chairman, and I thank the subcommittee chairman and the ranking member, and let me conclude by saying that this is not a perfect bill. I have major concerns with the NMB. It should not be in this bill. And if, in fact, there are problems as a result of the provisions put in this bill, it is my intent and the intent of many on our side to come back and try and address that in an appropriate way. There are many provisions in this bill that will enhance safety, and there are a number of provisions in this bill that will protect workers and workers' rights over at the FAA and the unions that represent employees at the Federal Aviation Administration. So I will be supporting the conference report, and I yield back the balance of our time.
Gentleman from Florida has 5 minutes remaining.
Thank you. And first, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert in the record a list of the staff who worked on H.R. 658.
Without objection.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I close today on this historic legislation, again, I can't thank enough folks like Mr. Costello, who will be leaving us, Mr. Ray Hall, our ranking member, the leader of the committee, Mr. Petri, and others who have been here helping and worked on this. I think Mr. Costello and Mr. Young summed it up. This is the work of many people. It is not exactly what any one of us individually would offer. The important thing is this provides some certainty in an uncertain time, and this process is very difficult. The Founding Fathers wanted it that way, but the American people want us to get the job done. Now, just to be factual, the other side again had 4 years in which they controlled this body, the United States Senate, and 2 years in which they had significant majorities and the presidency. And they could not get it done. They did 17 extensions. Back with, and let me praise Mr. DeFazio. I didn't see him here. He and I helped lead the effort to pass in 2003 a 4-year bill that expired in 2007. That means for the past 5 years we have not had revised and updated policy for our aviation system and for the FAA. And that hurts for the system. It hurts the American people. It hurts looking for safety improvements in the process, and it hurts people looking for expanded opportunities to be employed. Today we heard some good news on employment, and the good news is that some of the policies that went amok, the spending that went amok, the new regulations that went amok, this small band of people who were sent here have called a lot of that to a halt. It wasn't productive. This bill does not have tax increases in it. This bill does not have earmarks in it. This bill does not have any special plums or favors for anyone. And contrary to what's been said here today, this bill does not adversely affect labor. It's a fairness issue. The House passed a measure that would have codified and changed what the NMB changed in 70 years of labor law, allowing whoever showed up to vote into a union. It set out a fair process, and it was done with a compromise. And if you want to know what the delay was the first 4 years, let's be frank. It was a labor issue that the Democrats couldn't resolve among themselves, and they controlled the whole process. So I'm here 1 year later as chair, took some tough measures, and I will take tough measures to see that we get our job done. We stayed till 2:49 this morning to get the next piece of legislation. We have done and passed, and the President has signed an improvement to our pipeline safety, so important for energy, expanding energy sources, but making certain that that energy is coming to us in a safe and responsible manner. Today, we will pass in the House FAA, accounting for up to, I'm told, 11% of our gross domestic product, our economic activity for the country, $1.3 trillion in business activity, thousands of jobs. And let me tell you, too, we can't let labor, you can't let business go astray. It's our responsibility to set a steady course. Look, this is a very fragile industry. We just had announced American Airlines is going to cut more than 13,000 jobs in bankruptcy. Boeing, we almost lost jobs in South Carolina. We can't play those games, labor and business. We've got to come together and get people working. Aviation industry, not only passengers, which is so important flying, but aviation products, they are the core to our exports. So we can and we must get this done working together, and I'm pleased to yield back the balance of my time.
All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 533, the previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the conference report. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In opinion, Chair, the ayes have it. Gentleman from Wisconsin.
I request the ayes and nays.
The ayes and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the ayes and nays will rise. Sufficient number having arisen, the ayes and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this question will be postponed. Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of H.R. 3578 will now resume. The clerk will report the title.
Union Calendar Number 259, H.R. 3578, a bill to amend the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985 to reform the budget baseline.
Mr. Speaker.
The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to amend the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985 to reform the budget baseline.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the bill?
I am.
Gentleman qualifies. Clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Tierney of Massachusetts moves to recommit the bill, H.R. 3578, to the Committee on the Budget with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. In Section 257C of the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985, as added by Section 2, strike budgetary and insert except as provided in paragraph 3, budgetary. In paragraph 1 and after paragraph 2, add the following new paragraph. 3, maintaining current funding levels in real inflation-adjusted terms for Pell Grants and education programs for students, health and all discretionary spending that provide benefits for seniors, job, health, and all discretionary spending that provide benefits for veterans, and health research, including NIH and research to cure cancer. The discretionary portions of budget functions 500, education, training, employment, and social services, 550, health, 570, Medicare, 600, income security, 650, Social Security, and 700, Veterans Benefits and Services, other than unobligated balances, shall be adjusted for inflation as follows. A, the inflator used in paragraph 2 to adjust budgetary resources relating to personnel shall be the percent by which the average of the Bureau of Labor Statistics Employment Cost Index, wages and salaries, private industry workers, for that fiscal year differs from such index for the current year. B, the inflator used in paragraph 2 to adjust all other budgetary resources shall be the percent by which the average of the estimated gross domestic product chain-type price index for that fiscal year differs from the average of such estimated index for the current year.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the final amendment to this bill. It will not kill the bill, and it won't send it back to committee. If adopted, we'll then vote on the passage of the bill as amended. Mr. Speaker, when families in my district and across the country sit around the kitchen table and try to balance their budgets, they know that costs don't stay the same every year. They know the price of milk and gas and college and health care all go up. Yet H.R. 3578, left unamended, holds the budgetary baseline constant instead of allowing it to reflect increases in costs, making simple inflation adjustments look like increases in spending. Ignoring increases in costs will dramatically lower program levels in the baseline. Translated, this means that the priorities we support to help sustain the middle class and those aspiring to it, the programs we pay our taxes to support, will be cut as inflation eats into the accounts set in the budget. The Republican majority argues that America's middle class must make even more sacrifices to address our debt. The majority's mantra is that austerity alone, spending cuts focused only on non-defense discretionary domestic spending with no additional revenue and without closing any special interest tax loopholes, is all they think should be done. Never mind that it's largely their policies enforced under the last administration, aided and abetted by the then Federal Reserve Board chairman, that were largely responsible for the debt situation. Never mind that Federal Chairman Alan Greenspan has since testified that this was wrong, that his unconstrained free market winner-take-all theory had never worked in his 80-plus-year lifespan. Never mind that in the 1970s, we used to spend 5% of our national income on discretionary domestic spending, like education, job training, health, research, veterans, and infrastructure, and more recently, we've already pared that back to 2.5%. With this bill, the majority tries to balance the budget on the backs of workers, middle-class families, and small businesses in society's most challenged. They refuse to consider a fair distribution of our tax obligations. They even refuse to close special interest tax loopholes. The bill, if not amended, chooses shielding the extraordinarily well-off from any fair share of taxes over sustaining Pell Grants, student assistance promising opportunity to families. They choose allowing hedge fund managers the benefit of especially low tax rates over Meals on Wheels for seniors. And they choose special tax credits to the mature, extremely profitable oil and gas companies over providing security of housing for homeless veterans returning from duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. The austerity-only approach to addressing their largely self-induced debt is not the smart response to our economy's needs. We need to deal with our economic situation in a smart way, as attested by the majority of economists from all across the political divide. We need a gradual approach, balanced between spending cuts and revenues fairly distributed. Those need to be appropriately targeted in amount, share, and time, and not applied in a bludgeon fashion like this bill on the floor today. Choking off the middle class by cutting spending for education, health, jobs, job training, research, senior care, and our obligations to veterans is short-sighted. Studies and reports from international and national economists tell us that a vibrant middle class is essential for the well-being of our economy, imperative for businesses so they have customers for their goods and services, important to employers so they have the next generation of innovators, inventors, scientists, teachers, engineers, and generally capable workforce, and important to families and individuals as they seek personal and economic security. We shouldn't need to argue the important moral imperative of meeting our obligations to those suffering from debilitating health conditions and the families that support them, or to have the care of our seniors, especially those aged, alone, and poor, nor of our duty to our military forces, especially the wounded and disabled. Left as is, this bill is a step toward undoing all the progress, however slow, so far made in moving from the near depression caused by the failed policies of 2001 to 2008. Simply cutting spending on the middle class at the same time businesses and families have been forced to limit spending, and just as municipalities and states are trimming back, just adds to the downward spiral of fewer customers for our businesses, less growth for our economy, more layoffs, and on in a repeating circle. Make no mistake, this bill, if not amended, makes the dream of post-high school certificates or degrees or acquired job skills more remote for many, makes the visit of a neighbor and delivery of perhaps the day's only warm meal to seniors less likely, means research on debilitating health conditions or diseases may be delayed and the cure of cancers a more distant goal, and consigns our veterans to longer periods of homelessness and more difficulty getting the services they need to get a job. This amendment would allow the effects of inflation to be factored into the budgetary baseline so as to avoid automatic cuts in purchasing power that would otherwise result from this bill. Passing this amendment allows us to at least start on a path to the kind of America most of us envision, or at least it lessens the obstacles to that America that are thrown up by this legislation in its current form. Let's pass this amendment and start down a path that recalls what makes this country exceptional, the notion that everyone, no matter what economic or social condition one is born into, should have an equal opportunity to reach our goals, to an America reflecting that its people should shoulder and will shoulder any burden, suffer any sacrifice if shared fairly. Let's pass this amendment and add back at least a modest degree of balance and fairness. Mr. Chairman, I would hope that for those who count on us to be fair and just, or to make smart, targeted, and balanced approaches to our complex challenges, we could at least do that. I yield back the balance of my time and urge support of this amendment.
What purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the motion.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, this is another one of those common-sense reforms that I'm so proud that this Budget Committee has brought to the floor time and time again and will continue throughout the spring. And when I get back home, Mr. Speaker, folks say, Rob, why haven't you gotten this done already? And my friend from Massachusetts has just laid out exactly the reason why. I mean, these are politics of division, not of unity. These are politics of fear, not of hope. And I tell my friend, as he knows very well, this bill does not cut one penny from any of the priorities that he mentioned. My friend knows it to be true, Mr. Speaker. You know it to be true. And I say it to the American people today, what this bill does is to shine sunshine on what has been a budget process cloaked in darkness for far too long, and both parties have been complicit in that, Mr. Speaker, and both parties are going to unite today to change that history. Mr. Speaker, the folks back home want to see over 50 different duplicative job training programs plussed up year after year after year without any regard to their efficacy? No, they don't. Do folks back home want to see education programs that have failed our children time and time again plussed up, while those education programs that are successful go needy? No, they don't. Mr. Speaker, do folks want to see those income security programs that are providing insecurity to folks back home plussed up at the expense of those programs that can be a hand up out of poverty? I tell you they do not. This bill does one thing and one thing only. This bill provides honesty in our budget process. And if this motion to recommit passes, we will return to the days where confusion rather than clarity is the touchstone of this budget process. Chairman Ryan has given us an opportunity with this legislation to bring the American people into this debate, to make the budgeting here in this body look like the budgeting around the dinner table back home. Are expenses going up in this country? They are, Mr. Speaker. Are times tough in this country? Yes, they are. When we spend $10 today and $12 tomorrow, the American people know that we're spending more and not less. We can continue to put lipstick on this budget pig, as this motion to recommit would have us do, Mr. Speaker, but I encourage my colleagues to vote no on this motion to recommit and unite to throw open the doors to this institution and bring in budget sunshine once again. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.